This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Welcome to today's EDGE-inar on cultural competency and supplier diversity, particularly as it pertains to the geospatial industry. So you're all aware, you probably got the notification, but we are recording this webinar today. So we'll be able to send you the recording. Please feel free to share with other people. If you can try to make sure you're on mute unless you're speaking, that would be great. And feel free to be dropping questions in the chat throughout the EDGE-inar today. We'll try to answer some of them throughout, but we have allotted some time at the end just to have some engagement and questions and conversation as a group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith Searles, the founder of EDGE and owner of Urban GIS, to tell us more about EDGE, and then he will lead us into our conversation today.
Thank you, Heidi, and welcome everyone. So glad that you could join us. We're excited to have you. This is one of many events that we have been throwing and will be throwing. These EDGE-inars are meant to bring education, awareness to our geospatial field in the areas of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to also just get everyone excited about the things we're doing here at EDGE and to build a community. That's what it's all about, is building a network. We're looking forward to a future EDGE-inar where we're going to really break down what EDGE is all about. I apologize, I've got something going on in the background here. But today, I just briefly want to share with you some of the key principles of EDGE and who we are. We're an organization that is working towards nonprofit status, and our whole goal is to build a network within the geospatial community to provide exposure, opportunities, and to really just increase DEI awareness, participation, and efforts in our space. And we're looking to do that not as an agent of action directly ourselves in every case. It's more of an agency of education, inspiration, and a place of collaboration so that the folks who need the exposure and need the opportunities can get it. And then the companies and individuals who would like to do it, but maybe don't know how to do it, or maybe need it to be made a little bit easier and need the dots to be connected. We're trying to be that, we're trying to facilitate that organization. So 4 main pillars of EDGE. The first is on the talent and workforce diversity side. We know that our industry is not as diverse as it could be, not as inclusive as it could be. So we're trying to bring more individuals into the geospatial industry and GIS and all these other mapping fields. Secondarily, we are looking to do business diversity, supplier diversity. We're going to talk a lot about that today, and trying to connect small businesses with larger businesses so that there are more opportunities and just a better chance for small businesses to grow and then do their part with DEI. Third, it's about community outreach and trying to get that K through 12 level of exposure to geospatial fields. We know that many times if you can't see it, you can't be it. And there's so many kids who could fill the gaps we frankly have in this industry. Just in general, we're looking, it's an industry that needs more professionals, and there are a lot of companies who are looking for great talent, and we have to build that pipeline for that talent pool to be more diverse in years to come. And that also might include some level of assisting communities, disenfranchised communities, with pro bono GIS services, data, things of that nature. The last one is corporate responsibility and education. And that's a lot of what we're kind of talking about today, and helping companies to be more responsible in the area of DEI, to be more educated and more prepared to do the right things. So without further ado, I want to introduce our 2 guest speakers, great professionals, and just a couple housekeeping things. Certainly along the way, by all means, use the chat. We want this to be an interactive conversation. We are going to have a lot of time at the end for questions, and we're going to make sure that, hopefully you can take advantage of the great resources and knowledge that are here. You can also reach out to us and we can follow up. This will be recorded, as was mentioned, and then we can be available for additional questions. And I'm hoping that we'll have some future education opportunities where these gentlemen can provide some of their classes and coursework in this area. So this is kind of just teeing all of that up. So I will start with Dr. Fred Coleman. So Dr. Fred Coleman is someone I've known for many years, and I'm excited to have him here on the panel and to be working with EDGE. Actually, as a student at the University of Illinois, as a civil engineering student, I started an organization called Civil Engineers of Diverse Ethnicity. So here we are many years later doing the same work, but just at a different scale. So Dr. Coleman was like our executive mentor and was always a personal mentor for me at the University of Illinois. And in 2001, he created and incorporated Coleman and Associates, a consulting firm focused on supplier diversity in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry. Dr. Coleman has over 20 years of experience in academic and business settings, utilizing expertise in engineering and supply chain management to manage organizations, develop programs, consult, and publish. Dr. Coleman has developed and managed supplier diversity programs and initiatives for state agencies, local governments, and educational institutions, where the focus has been to enhance the utilization of minority and women business enterprises in architecture, engineering, and construction. He's just been an industry leader on a national level for many years in this area of supplier diversity. And his background, graduate of Michigan State University, and then he was an assistant professor in civil engineering at the University of Illinois, and then also a visiting assistant professor in supply chain management at the GIES College of Business at the University of Illinois. And then 2015, he retired from there, and he retired as the director of diversity and redevelopment for the university's Office of Capital Programs, Real Estate Services. And thank you, Dr. Coleman, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Moving on to our next panelist, Kevin Skwira-Brown, excuse me. And I know I still probably messed that up. So
no, you got it.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So Kevin is the founding partner and full-time trainer consultant at Cultural Fluency Associates. He has 10 years of direct social service experience, has taught at the collegiate level for over 20 years, and continues to do grassroots multicultural community organizing. For the past 12 years, he has developed, presented, and facilitated diversity, inclusion, and cultural development work with individuals and organizations striving to live in line with their values and missions. In addition to the intercultural development IDI work, Kevin delivers workshops, keynote presentations, and multi-day sessions on white privilege, engaging participants with humility, respect, and authenticity. Clients include colleges, universities, city and county government, foundations, nonprofit schools, and religious organizations. His community work is highlighted by the Media Policy Center in the PBS special, Our Kids, narrowing the opportunity gap, which premiered in 2019. Kevin, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Keith. It's great to be here.
Awesome, gentlemen. Let's just jump right into it and get our questions going. Dr. Coleman, I'll start with you. Why do you do this work? Why supplier diversity? Why DEI work? What is it about it that brought you here?
Well, that's a great question. My answer is simply that I believe in the American free enterprise system. And that is because I have observed that it works if people are given a level playing field, they're willing to work hard and learn, they can be successful in America. However, it is well documented there are barriers to entry based on a wide host of factors that prevent minorities and underrepresented populations from having access to opportunities so that they can participate in fulfilling the free enterprise element of the American dream. I grew up in a multicultural environment, and in my work as a consultant in supplier diversity, I am working to fulfill the economic opportunity aspect of the American dream.
Very good. I appreciate that. Kevin, if I can ask you the same thing, why this work and why are you passionate about it?
Sure. Thank you for that. So one of my central purposes in life is to really foster greater insight and learning so that we can all be our best selves. It applies to my own life, to my parenting, my friendships, and fortunately for me, it applies to the work I get to do every day. As a white male with a number of other privileged identities, I feel a particular responsibility to apply myself to the issues of injustice. And so this is where I choose to spend my time.
That's very noble and greatly appreciated. We love the work that you're doing and are happy to be partnering with you. So defining the two areas that you all specialize in, and I love the mix that we have here. It's kind of like the thunder and lightning backfield. We got the inside game, we got the outside game, and it all comes together and works together. So, you know, I know many people in our audience are still new to these areas, and that's what we're here to do, is to explain, and hopefully for those who do know something about it, that, you know, they can learn a little bit more. But Kevin, let's start with you. If you can talk, you know, a little bit more about cultural competence, and you know, what does that term mean and what's involved in that arena?
Sure. Thanks, Keith. So cultural competence is a term that's, you know, has been around for decades, really. And it's actually one that I don't care for as much. When I think about competence, I think about, you know, learning to drive a car. So I got a driver's license, you know, 40 some years ago. I took a test and I was checkmarked, considered competent to drive a car. Never needed to go back, never needed to sort of review or improve my skills around that. So instead, I use the term cultural fluency, because fluency for me brings to mind the notion of sort of like language acquisition. Like, do you take one class and you're fluent in a language? Certainly not. So fluency is sort of a lifetime endeavor. And I think this work is fluency work. I think cultural fluency is a lifetime endeavor. I define cultural fluency sort of in relatively simple terms as the ability to engage effectively across cultural difference in ways that are honoring and validating for everyone involved. It applies to all kinds of cultural differences. But we might first think of things like race. Like, how do we navigate, given our own identities, the systemic and internalized biases towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color? We might think about age. How do baby boomers and Gen X folks engage work, think about work differently? We might think about communication styles, direct versus indirect, emotionally expressive, emotionally restrained, or how introverts and extroverts experience the world differently and engage in the world differently. Cultural fluency applies to all of those settings and more, because difference is everywhere. So improving our cultural fluency improves our work and professional relationships, our home relationships, and frankly, our social relationships.
Very good, very good. I appreciate that. It's something after meeting you, become that much more familiar, and I'm sure we'll have some great questions to follow up on all those insights. Dr. Coleman, tell us a little bit more about supplier diversity, business diversity, and those arenas.
Sure, happy to. First, let me start by defining what is a, quote, diverse supplier, and then I'll define supplier diversity. A diverse supplier is a business that is at least 51% owned and operated by an individual or group that is part of a traditionally underrepresented or underserved group. Common classifications are small business enterprises, minority-owned business enterprises, and women-owned business enterprises. Over time, the definition of diversity has expanded to include businesses owned by other minority groups such as LGBTQ and veterans and proprietors with disabilities. In general, supplier diversity is a business strategy that ensures a diverse supplier base in the procurement of goods and services for any business or organization. It emphasizes the creation of a diverse supply chain that works to secure the inclusion of diverse groups in the procurement plans for governments, not-for-profits, and private industry. In other words, supplier diversity refers to a supply chain that incorporates businesses owned by diverse individuals or groups.
Very good. So Dr. Coleman, continuing with you, where's the overlap? How do these two things kind of work together?
Well, Kevin has given us a great definition of cultural fluency, and thank you for that, Kevin. Supplier diversity involves building, and I emphasize this, relationships with diverse suppliers who are outside of your company. The key operative is relationships. This is where cultural fluency has a role in helping build relationships through avoidance of stereotypes, language, and preconceived ideas about diverse vendors who are seeking to build relationships with your company.
Great. Kevin, do you want to chime in on that as well?
Boy, I agree with everything Dr. Coleman's just saying. And so cultural fluency is sort of a broader umbrella that applies to all areas of one's business, staffing to decision-making models, policies, to operations, supplier, vendor, and customer relationships. So I see each of those functions, they can be executed with more or less degrees of cultural fluency. Again, effectiveness across those cultural differences. Keith, you're muted.
Thank you so much. What does cultural fluency look like for at the individual level, at the organizational level, and then what are some tangible examples that people can latch on to?
And who would you like to start with, Keith?
You can start, Kevin.
Okay. So again, when we think about cultural fluency as that ability to create effective relationships and policies and programs that are inclusive. We've been talking about diversity, and then we're going to introduce this notion of inclusion now. We can have diversity without creating productive relationships. In fact, diversity alone often increases tensions if the environment isn't open to new and different ways of operating. And that's where the inclusion comes in. So for me, diversity, we would measure diversity in sort of the numbers, like how many, how do we look, or what's the representation? Inclusion is about is measured by how folks feel. Are people seen? Are people heard? Are people meaningfully included? So we can diversify any part of operations, and yet if we treat everyone as if they were, let's say, traditional white males and push a top-down management style, we're likely to find that it doesn't really create the kind of buy-in, productivity, or retention that serves an organization. At the individual level, we can look at things like, what are our assessments, our evaluations we're making, our reactions, our judgments, our behaviors. We'll look at things that include terms like, implicit bias, microaggressions, intent versus impact, and notions of equity versus equality. At the organizational level, when we talk about cultural fluency, we're considering policies, procedures, and practices, the norms, the expectations, the climate of the organization. So one specific example might be the hiring process. The hiring process is filled with what a colleague of mine calls discretionary points, places where subjective judgments influence the outcome of who gets the job and how well they do once they get hired. Everything from where does the application get placed? What is the language in the application? What is the screening process? What criteria are used to determine that someone's a good fit or an adequate sort of meets the criteria? If those processes are unwittingly built to serve a particular segment of society, then we shouldn't be surprised that it's that segment who repeatedly gets hired and subsequently thrives in an organization. So diversity has to be paired with inclusion to have the effects that we really, really want to have.
Well stated. Really appreciate that. Dr. Coleman, you want to talk about it on the supplier diversity side of things and give us some tangible examples?
Sure. When we talk about, what does supplier diversity look like, and I'll start with individuals. So for individuals within an organization, supplier diversity means being introduced to vendors and service providers who are new to your organization and may differ from you based on their gender, race, or even be a veteran. It simply means getting to know and work with people you may not have worked with in the past. Therefore, the importance of building relationships, and as Kevin has mentioned, cultural fluency based on mutual respect, enhancing your cultural competence, and a focus on win-win for all stakeholders. Now, for organizations, it depends on where your company is in the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And I'll shorten diversity, equity, and inclusion to DEI going forward. So large companies that started their DEI journey in the 80s or 90s have defined DEI as having 4 main pillars. For example, Centene Corporation, a major healthcare provider, defines DEI as talent, community engagement, supplier diversity, and stakeholder collaboration. Similarly, Colgate-Palmolive Corporation defines DEI as people, community, supplier diversity, and communication. For these companies, supplier diversity is part of how they do business every day. For companies starting their DEI journey with supplier diversity as a key pillar, I believe they must work to align their mission, values, and goals in order to shape their corporate culture to be inclusive internally and externally.
Wonderful. Appreciate that answer. And then Kevin, moving on, then how does one assess or measure, the level of cultural fluency and development on the individual and organizational level? How do you assess those sort of things?
Sure. So Keith, so that's a big question. So I'm going to take just a little bit more time as I answer that. It looks like we're doing okay on time. I think about cultural fluency as the goal, and it's sort of like a river that has more than one tributary. For a long time, the only sort of tributary I was aware of in terms of building cultural fluency was what we commonly call the social justice approach, anti-racism work, white supremacy work, white privilege work. But as we expand that beyond just race, it becomes sort of anti-oppression work. So it's understanding how to build more inclusive spaces relative to all of the isms. So social justice approach. And for a long, long time, that's what I was exposed to. That's what I learned. That's really what I sort of worked out of. More recently, I've learned about sort of another approach for building cultural fluency. And I think about that as another tributary to this river, and that's the intercultural development approach. And the intercultural development approach really looks at how have I learned as an individual, and then again as an organization, how have we developed a pattern of how do we engage across cultural similarity and difference. And when I come to understand sort of my own cultural practices around engaging around cultural similarity and difference, gives me insight into what those impacts might be when people are culturally different from me. So if I think about those as the two tributaries, each of those have assessments that are sort of available either at the individual or the organizational level for thinking about where are we at? And then the second question, how do we build our cultural fluency? So in terms of assessment tools, the intercultural approach has a licensed inventory. It's called the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. And it's been, verified by, its reliability and credibility is cross-cultural and been verified by lots and lots of research. And it gives us at the individual level an understanding of what are my strategies for engaging on cultural similarity and difference, and then what are the other options that I might be choosing from, maybe haven't learned well or haven't been conscious of. And so that's an assessment tool in the intercultural realm. From the social justice realm, there's a number of assessments. There might be some that we might think of that sort of relate to that. The IAT, which is the Harvard's implicit bias test, is sort of a little segment of my sort of cultural fluency, as it were, as it relates to bias. I would say on that side, the individual assessments are a little bit more sparse. The organizational assessments are pretty rich. Crossroads has a multicultural organizational development model that allows organizations to think about what stage of organizational development are they through a multicultural lens. Joseph Barnt has some really good material out there. There are equity audits available online from lots of different providers, either just for free to use and or through their contracting with them. So that kind of assessment can happen. But I also think it's important for us to recognize that there's experiential data that we can collect, again, both at the individual level and the organizational level, to say, how am I showing up? What kind of feedback am I getting? And am I really hearing it? What are the measures of diversity in my organization? It's a starting point, but really, what are the measures of inclusion in my organization? And how about my team? Do my team, as diverse as they might be, feel like I'm someone they can approach? Am I seen as and experienced as someone who's engaging around their differences in ways that are honoring and respectful? So again, experiential data, there's outcome data, there's satisfaction data, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, retention. So lots of different ways that we might assess sort of where we at. Then the next step is sort of like, how do we build that? So we have some assessment of where we are at the individual organizational level. How do you build then cultural fluency? At the individual level, we can understand ourselves better. So cultural self-awareness. We can also understand others better, cultural other awareness. That would be from the intercultural realm. From the social justice realm, there's learning about the patterns of oppression, patterns of privilege, and then how those get manifest at the intrapersonal level in the way that I see and think about the world, my interpersonal interactions, how I engage with other people, and then at the organizational level, how we structure policies, practices, norms, expectations, those kinds of things. And so there's a whole bunch of work that we can do in either of those places. I really feel like there's a value in starting with that intercultural piece because it allows us to get sort of a baseline as to how am I even thinking about difference? How am I thinking about difference? And oftentimes people are surprised by the results of their intercultural assessment. And yet when we have a conversation with them about that, they go, yeah, this makes sense. This is how I'm doing things. And it puts them in a position of empowerment to say, and I'd like to do them a little bit differently. So a long answer, Keith, but
no,
it's a big question.
Yeah, no, and as you said, we're doing great on time. We're here to have a conversation. And actually, before I go to Dr. Coleman, I want to follow up and ask you, how many organizations are doing this type of work, and how, I guess, where are we in the process, just as a community, in understanding the importance of this sort of thing and being intentional in doing it?
So, being really frank, there's some events that have happened in this country over the last 5 to 6 years that have increased the consciousness of folks from dominant culture with regards to the need to be doing this and to be doing this at all kinds of organizations. So folks are probably on this from across the United States and beyond. So I live in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota. When George Floyd was murdered on the streets of Minneapolis in Minnesota, that was a wake-up call for a lot of dominant culture folks. And organizations who thought, well, we're just fine, started to think we better look a little closer to see how sort of the dynamics of implicit bias, of assumptions about people, of how we engage might need a closer look. So there was certainly an uptick in interest that I saw and that colleagues of mine saw with regards to around those events. I think it comes and goes in terms of broad interest, although I think it's increasing because I think as more and more companies recognize that in order to be competitive, we need to both attract diverse thought, because diverse thought has been proven to create more creative, innovative ideas. And the demographics of this country mean that dominant culture folks can't just continue to count on hiring more dominant culture folks. We can't just hire a bunch of white folks to fill all of our work roles and to be our customers. The world doesn't look like that anymore. This country looks increasingly not like that. And so even folks who don't have a mission value kind of incentive to do this find a business case for figuring out how do we reach and retain diverse talent and diverse customer base. And in order to do that, very rightly, there's an expectation that the spaces that we provide and the ways that we conduct ourselves are honoring and respectful of everyone. So I'm seeing an uptick in interest. I think there's often difficulty for folks to understand, like, so what do we do? How do we do it? So I think there's that still. But I've seen more and more organizations invested in doing the work.
I'm going to interject really quick, Kevin. There's some questions in the chat about some of the assessments and resources you've been talking about. I know we have some for Dr. Coleman, and I believe I have the Harvard implicit bias one. Are there any other links you can share or places we can refer people to? Or is that coming soon on another webinar?
Well, no, I'm happy to. The question came up, and so the the IDI is owned by a company called IDI.LLC. In order to do the IDI, you have to connect with a certified administrator. They call them qualified administrators, a QA. And so it's someone who's been trained to deliver the IDI assessment. So if you would search your local region, you could find IDI qualified administrators. You could probably find them. It actually gets done online. So I do them with people across the country. So you can work with someone who isn't in your geographic region to do the IDI. Crossroads, I don't have their link. Sorry about that, Heidi. But if you look up MCOD Continuum Crossroads, you're going to find that. It's a well documented piece. Joseph Barnes written a couple different books. His material is mostly in his books. And then the equity audit tools, I know that I've shared some with some of the folks in EDGE, so we could push out some of those lists as a follow-up perhaps.
Yeah, and then also folks feel free to follow up with Kevin directly, and this is his expertise and this is what he does and he's really good at it. So we're here to promote his work, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our EDGE certification that we're trying to create. And part of that process would be working with folks like Kevin to do that assessment work to help to figure out where you are in your company and develop a plan to do things in a better way. So, you know, don't think that these are things that you have to just do by yourself. And sometimes starting off, it may be better to work with a certified professional. So with that in mind, Dr. Coleman, can you talk a little bit more about assessment, measurement, and being intentional in doing that in the world of supplier diversity?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'd like to sort of answer that question from the perspective of, you know, how do you develop a supplier diversity program? And then I'll talk a little bit about assessing. So in terms of how do you start a supplier development program, it starts with reflecting on company culture and values. Company leadership and decision makers need to identify whether and to what degree diversity, social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and their own internal company diversity align with their company's mission and values. So it starts off with a reflection. The company has to be very intentional and reflective in terms of understanding where they are with respect to those kinds of values. Once those values are determined, it is important to identify how those factors can be rated and tracked. An easy example is money spent with diverse suppliers and the number of diverse suppliers in your supply chain. They're sort of straightforward metrics to track for supplier diversity. 3, establish a business case for supplier diversity. The why behind the business case is often competitiveness on a local and global scale through diversification of talent attraction, and opening of new markets as the diversity of the US population increases. Step 4, through research involving benchmarking and best practices, establish a company-wide supplier diversity policy that not only states the importance of supplier diversity, but shares the overall framework for the supplier diversity program. This framework would include goals, sourcing processes, outreach, accountability, and communications. 5, establish an executive level champion, someone who will be an active voice in and for the company at supplier diversity events and networks. This person should be visible and have a key operational role within the company. They have the role of being what's often called an internal champion. 6, last but not least, is to work to identify diverse suppliers that align with your business case for supplier diversity. You want to reach out to your peers who have supplier diversity programs. You want to engage industry groups like the National Minority Supplier Development Council and local ethnic business chambers of commerce, as well as attend supplier diversity events. Doing all of those things will help you identify diverse suppliers.
So Dr. Coleman, I want to kind of have a follow-up question for you a little bit off the cuff here. So I am part of an advisory committee with the ESRI Partner Advisory. ESRI, excuse me, part of their partner network. There's a committee that helps ESRI to think about issues as far as being a business partner with ESRI and how they can better serve. And my goal is to help ESRI to be more diversified and equitable and inclusiveness within that partner network and pool. How does a supplier diversity program and a more formal supplier diversity program work for an organization like that, whose goal is to be more diverse and inclusive? And, you know, can you talk about just how they work in tandem?
Sure. So a major part of what that would involve would be some of the work that you're pioneering already with EDGE. And so I applaud you guys and all the folks who are involved with EDGE who are doing that. I think for an organization like ESRI that is seeking to become more inclusive, I think part of what they have to do is be very intentional about understanding how their work, what they do, impacts the world. And I mentioned things like environmental sustainability and things of that nature. We know, GIS and all of the practitioners get it with environmental sustainability and transportation. But there's also this very large human element with respect to mapping, with respect to populations and densities and the spatialness of that. But oftentimes the impact of that is not clearly given to, or the recipients of those underserved communities are not beneficiaries of that. And so I think there has to be a very strong consciousness from ESRI and its partners to understand that they have that linkage, that those tools are being used in that way, and that they should be working to empower those communities and vendors within those communities to understand how GIS can be a very strong tool to help them improve their market share, to help them better serve their customers, and the kind of analysis that GIS offers, obviously on a spatial sense. And so it's really about ESRI and its partners taking a more conscious, inclusive approach to understanding how their business impacts underserved and underrepresented communities, and then reaching out to those underserved, underrepresented communities and helping provide them, on one side, the tools and understanding and expertise and the importance of GIS, but on the other side, developing the supplier-developer relationships to empower those businesses and have those businesses be customers and vendors to ESRI and its partners. And I thought about this earlier and said, well, for GIS type companies that are practicing in the spatial field, what are some things that they would be purchasing or would need in their supply chain? Well, obviously, information technology is very important. And so, the next time you go through a cycle of upgrading your IT infrastructure, you should be looking at seeking diverse suppliers who can provide you with those IT hardware and software and peripherals. They would also obviously be in a position to provide services, if you will. There may be, there's often minority and women-owned accounting firms and legal firms that could help you in terms of your supplier diversity program. So I realize and understand that a lot of ESRI and GIS related stuff is going to be related to professional services. And so that's why I mentioned things like accountants and legals and IT folks. But also, just in terms of everyday practical stuff, in terms of, say, maybe construction and the identification of items that are out in the field. There are many minority-owned surveying and firms that support GIS type companies and all the kinds of GIS endeavors that are out there. And so it's really about being intentional and seeking out those diverse vendors and professional service firms that can support ESRI and the types of firms that ESRI is partnering with.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that and agree completely. And I think we have a unique opportunity in our industry, as you mentioned, from the standpoint that we provide services that are very germane to this DEI work, this social justice and racial equity type of work. And so we're uniquely positioned and then possibly have that much more responsibility, right, to kind of be at the forefront in an industry that is maybe pushing the needle a little bit more in tech than some other industries are. I think there's the other aspect of the fact that this is an industry that is growing rapidly. And unlike so many other industries within America, this one is on the rise. And right now, our problem is being able to find enough talent to meet the opportunities. So I think trying to find a more diverse talent pool as well as a more diverse vendor base really helps everyone, right? Not only in ideas, but just meeting that marketplace and possibly trying to bring more people into the industry that have all of the tools. They're just not as aware, maybe need a little bit of training, some assistance, some support. But this is a unique chance to get a triple, quadruple, bottom line.
Well, I certainly agree. And the beauty of GIS is that it is such a powerful tool. And my experience is that once people get exposed to it and recognize the power behind GIS and what it means for communities, when that message gets spread throughout a very wide and diverse population with talent, then new ideas come forward for how GIS can be applied and leveraged to improve lives, improve business cases, expand markets, et cetera, et cetera. And so that diversification of talent is very important to the GIS industry. And like I mentioned before, the expansion of global competitiveness that, obviously US companies find and is very, very important in their own future growth.
Thank you. Kevin, I want to pivot over to you, kind of staying on the same topic, but just switch it a little bit and broaden it out. So just larger companies, I mean, this applies to smaller companies, but particularly larger companies who maybe benefit greatly from, a lot of government contracts, from a lot of organizations that essentially is coming from a diverse funding base, whether that's taxes or some other, constituency. How does the work that you're talking about affect things even on the outside? So when people are more intentional on the inside, what are the public relations ramifications? What are the opportunities for them to demonstrate on a national level with government agencies and a large client base that they're serious about DEI and therefore, they should be looked at and appreciated and valued accordingly?
Sure. Well, thanks. I mean, I think about a couple different things. One, I think about if anyone knows, there's a company named Starbucks who had a situation a few years back where the internal training of their store managers or a store manager caused a huge impact for the company, right? So big companies have big liability. And I think today when things get recorded so easily, when things get passed along, through the internet so easily, it's like anyone can be under a microscope. And so the importance of showing up well, I think, is highlighted. And I think it's highlighted in a time in which people have more choices. We have more choices as to where we get our services, who we use as our suppliers or our customer, like what companies we go to and which companies we avoid. And so, so the first piece I would say is that the liability is strong and the expectation is high, I would say, in the community generally. And so then a company has the opportunity to sort of showcase their work, to showcase themselves as someone who's serious about the work. And I think one of the risks in this is this notion of image versus sort of who we really are. There can be a wanting to put on a really good face, like that actually I think is counterproductive. This notion that, oh, we want to make it look like we're really, everything's happy inside our company, all smiley faces. That's probably not the case. And that's actually a company that I would have a little suspicion of. I think doing the work means being willing to have the humility to say, we made a mistake, it doesn't align with our values, and here's what we're doing to fix it. So whether it's a small company or a large company, I think that exists. We might certainly say that large companies who are utilizing public dollars have a heightened obligation to respond to the entire community. Historically, large systems have responded to dominant culture and dominant culture interests and dominant culture needs. And that continues to happen. It happens in our school system, and I think it happens in social work. So my background is I'm a licensed social worker. So I mentioned social work because it's easy to point fingers at other people's professions, but it happens in social work. It happens in education. I've been in both of those professions. It happens in other organizations and other sectors. And so I think there's as Dr. Coleman articulated so clearly, there's a competitive advantage being the kind of place where people want to work and where people want to bring their business. Or maybe, I don't know if there's more follow-up, Keith, ask, but that's my thoughts at the moment.
No, I appreciate that. What I want to do is I have another question that I want to save to the end to give people some practical take-home things, but we're going to save that. I'd like to shift towards the audience, jumping in with their questions and potential things that they'd like to have you guys talk about. And while we're maybe teeing up that first question, or while someone is getting themselves ready to be unmuted, I give you guys a chance to have any crosstalk, any comments or things that you want to share, what you heard that you want to respond to.
Well, I would, Dr. Coleman, I loved how you laid out that sort of here, this, step 1, step 2, step 3. I think that gives people a lot of great direction. And I think there's a ability to take that with regards to supplier diversity and do a next to it, given another arena of the business practice. I heard things like engage the community. Think about what your goals are. Connect it to the bottom, to sort of to the business case. There are folks in any organization who do this because it's part of their heart. Like they recognize that this is important to them either personally and or some organizations. It'll be important to some people in the organization with regards to mission. And there are other folks who just aren't as connected to that. So if you want to bring everyone as much as possible along, one of the ways to do that is to recognize we can come to it for different reasons. If we're doing the same thing, like I'm kind of okay with that. Like I'll work with folks regardless of what their motivation is to become more culturally fluent, because I think it serves people to be more culturally fluent. It serves themselves and it serves others. So I just want to echo that and just say what a useful framework that is and how much that applies to other arenas as well.
Well, that's great, Kevin. I really appreciate that, and I echo that very, very much. I've been lucky and fortunate to have worked with organizations that went through processes to be more inclusive with their minority and women workforce, and we're very intentional about helping their majority workers understand the real importance of inclusivity and how people feel at work, what people can contribute at work, and how their behavior influences that, if you will. And so it was, you know, for the companies that I work for, you know, it was a focus on, you know, productivity. It was a focus on output. It was a focus on trying to get everyone to operate and work at their very highest level of competency, which obviously benefits the organization and benefits the company's bottom line. And so if you have, you know, some percentage of your workforce that's really not contributing because they don't feel like they're not being included or appreciated, or, you know, other issues that surrounding race, gender, or culture, then they're not providing you with information and ideas to help you improve your company's performance and bottom line. And particularly when you bring in people who are not traditionally in a lot of positions or roles, and in particular if they're from an international background, you know, that's, you know, those companies are missing out. And because the international students and international professionals, as well as people from underrepresented groups and underserved populations, they bring a whole different set of experiences and insights that need to be tapped into and explored, because it often yields a different, better way of doing something. It often creates a more productive team environment. And so anytime you can get, you know, more productivity out of your team, and that team gels and works well together, that's a real plus for your company and your organization.
Wonderful, wonderful. Audience, are we ready? Heidi, I don't know if you have anything teed up. Do we have someone who'd like to jump in and ask the first audience question or comment for our panelists to speak to? Interactive program, folks, so don't be shy. Jump on in and
There's not a question in there yet, but I'll read Albert's comment because I think it's worth drawing attention to, especially if people don't have access to the chat in the recording. He said, thanks for mentioning those companies who get public money. Sometimes that is overlooked when it comes to a company's responsibility and accountability.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I'd love for you all to comment a little bit more, because I think when we talk about the measures, right, and you know, often people will say, hey, we're doing great with small business, right? So what does that mean when you say small business? Are we talking, you know, businesses in the US? Are we talking international businesses? Are we talking businesses that no matter where they are very well represented in a particular industry? Or are we talking about constituents that may not, you know, be as well represented? And then when you look at government dollars, and you can have some direct measures such as population. So for instance, if the population of the US is approximately 13% African-American, and if you look at the business spend for African-American owned companies, and it's 1 to 2%, are we really achieving some of the small business goals at a level that is commensurate to the spend that the client is providing for a certain company? Just as one example, and maybe Kevin, you can speak to it from another aspect outside of the, you know, direct supplier diversity side. But I'd love to get you all's thoughts about particularly companies that work with, you know, government dollars on a large scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and forgive me if I'm reiterating something I've articulated already, but you know, when they're public dollars, be it our public schools or our city government or our county government or our state government, or other entities that get, you know, federal funding, the expectation should be they serve everyone in the community. And when we do a satisfaction survey, and so I live in northern Minnesota. So for folks on the tip of Lake Superior, Duluth, Minnesota, on the tip of Lake Superior, a couple hours from Canada, it's a significantly white community. About 90% of the folks in the region identify as white on any given identification, self-identification. And so it's really easy for entities here to do a satisfaction survey and have so many white folks respond that regardless of how BIPOC folks are experiencing that organization, the white folks' response are going to sort of drive the results. So our graduation rates for white middle-class kids in my public school system is reasonable. It's quite reasonable. But if we disaggregate the data, and that's the piece I would say, Keith, that sort of it transitions from your question, but the importance of disaggregating the data. So we have internal satisfaction data. We have retention data. Well, we're keeping, year after year, we're keeping 87% of our employees. That sounds pretty good. Well, what percentage of our BIPOC, of our LGBTQA, what percentage of our non-Christian, what percentage of folks who are marginalized in other ways, our veterans, et cetera. So one of the keys is to start disaggregating our data, breaking it down into subgroups so we can measure how are we doing with each of these subgroups. And to your point, Keith, historically, both publicly funded and I would say many, many privately funded organizations have served the majority. And for a while it was a numerical majority, it's really a power majority. So as organizations learn sort of the hard lessons of, that's not a big enough piece of the corporate pie. Like, we need to serve the whole community. That's the business case. We need to then be able to disaggregate our data and say, how is our messaging landing for these folks and those folks? How are our services landing for these folks and those folks? As opposed to overall, how are we doing? The overall how are we doing question just isn't sufficient, I don't think, when we're really looking at the kinds of goals that most organizations have in terms of growth in the current multicultural environment that we're in.
Thank you, Kevin. And Dr. Coleman, would you like to talk about equity in this sense, and supplier diversity and intentionality in aligning kind of the benefit you're getting from the constituents versus your ability to serve them?
Yeah, I think Kevin has done a really good job of illuminating that and clarifying that. And so, it's really a matter of, I think that, companies and corporations, when they're receiving public funds, and I think the point that you're making that, you need to serve all elements of the population. The census data is very clear that, the population in this country is going to be, pretty much minority majority at some point around 2050. Okay. And when you think about how this country has developed and has grown and benefited from, all the different waves of immigration that have come to the United States since the United States has been in existence. And then you think about, that we're living and working in a global competitive environment. And so as time rolls on, it's 2022 now, it'll be 2030 before you know it, 2040, before you know it. We in the United States have a very unique and real opportunity to make sure that as this growing and burgeoning minority population continues to expand, that the economy supports them and that they are very much included and inclusive in everything that we traditionally define as American. And we're seeing a lot of that now in terms of, major cities with, diverse mayors. Their administrations are very diverse. Many of the presidential administrations are very diverse. And so, and it looks great. It feels great when you see people from various ethnicities who you don't traditionally associate with certain positions and posts being in those positions and posts. And so to me, that's very heartening. Okay. But there's still a lot of work to do, because if you look statistically and you disaggregate the data, as Kevin has talked about, you'll often find that Black and Brown communities are, lagging in a number of very key social and economic indicators. And so, it is not to the benefit of this country to have significant population groups that are underutilized and and not being at very good economic and social status points in the country. And so by embracing inclusivity and embracing supplier diversity and understanding that this country is a free enterprise capitalist system and values that very much, even though we have a very large social and public component to our life in the United States, it is still pretty much a free enterprise capitalist country. And so utilizing and leveraging our strengths, both in the public sector and private sector, to continue to perform on a very high global competitiveness level is very important for the future of the United States going forward.
Awesome, wonderful. Heidi, you want to jump in?
Sure. Sean has a question in the chat. He said, I think it's often easy to reach out to our followers, so to speak, the body of individuals and organizations that care about the issues we talk about here. But what could we do to reach a broader audience that may or may not necessarily be aware of these things or be active in implementing solutions? In other words, how do we actually get our message out and not just talk to those who are already listening to us? It's a great question.
Either of you can feel free to jump in on that.
Sure. Yeah, that sort of goes back to, preaching to the choir, if you will. And of course, the choir is already on board. It's, from my experience, it sometimes, unfortunately, as Kevin has alluded to, it boils down to, a very unfortunate incident that makes people want to or jars them out of their current state of mind. I think part of it too, though, is that if there are people within your organization, people who are different from you, I think part of it is having those initial conversations and seeing in part what bubbles up from them and trying to make sure that their voices are heard and are appreciated. And so it's a challenge to do that, and I realize that, I get that. And there are probably some other avenues and approaches that could be used as well. A lot of it is, trying to get people to work outside of their comfort zone. And so a lot of companies have initiatives where they have very large volunteer efforts or very large charitable efforts. And I would encourage, that one way is to get employees to be engaged in those opportunities so that they do get exposure to different cultures and different population groups and different, life circumstances. And so that, through that exposure, they can possibly become more reflective, and that might help them also become more sensitive to these kinds of discussions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Kevin, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, Dr. Coleman, I really appreciate that. And it reminds me that, in some ways the question is sort of what moves people, and what moves people if they're not sort of where we think we would sort of identify, perhaps, or they would identify, maybe that we would identify as saying, oh, they're not in the choir, right? So sometimes it is personal relationship. And sometimes, I find this question difficult, frankly. That's that question of how do you help people see the impacts of how they see the world, and even just change how they see the world. It's one of the reasons I like the intercultural development inventory so much. I do these inventories with people on a regular basis. And recently I was working with someone whose worldview was pretty early in its development with regards to intercultural. They were pretty clear that the way they grew up was just fine, and they didn't need to attend to the other things. And when they did that inventory, they weren't an uncaring person. And it gave them an opportunity to see how they're showing up and what that might look like. And the response was, I said, so given all this, what do you think? You know, do you see a desire, a need, a motivation to do things differently? And they said, my obligation to my company, to doing my work well, requires that I do that. So while for years and years and years, this person hadn't seen a whole lot of incentive to sort of change their framework, to broaden their lens, they're like, yeah, now you're showing me in front of me and explaining to me, not blaming, not shaming, but saying, so here's how you're telling me you show up in the world. And do you see where that lands here? And now I've explained the impacts of that. Before we even got to your results, I explained the impacts of each of these approaches. How do you feel about that? And they go, yeah, that's not where I want to be. So different things move different people. Sometimes it's relationship. Sometimes it's a relationship. I have stories that I could share about people in my community who, you know, sort of broadcast their transformation, right? Their aha moment. A white person who didn't believe in white privilege or white supremacy until they were riding in a car with one of their colleagues who is African heritage. And in this case, it was a police incident. They both saw the look that they got from a particular police officer. And I'm not trying to bash police officers. We could talk schoolwork, we could talk teachers. This example happens to be a police thing, but it happens in classrooms. It happens in social work. It happens in retail. So I just want to acknowledge that. But this one happened to have been a police incident. And the white person said, whoa, what was that about? You know, like, why did we just get that? And the person said, that happens to me all the time. And the white person said, you're kidding. It's like, no. And that's what broke the ice. So what moves people is sometimes hard to predict and sometimes hard to manufacture, though we can sometimes do that by the things that Dr. Coleman said, which is create overlap between experience, but it's got to be genuine. Because we can go into that situation from a dominant culture place. It's like middle-class folks helping people who are experiencing poverty. We can go into that from a place of huge judgment. Oh, if you just had middle-class values, you'd be just fine. That's not transformational. It's not even useful. So there has to be some preparation or some reflection or some ability, I think, to be able to help people sort of navigate the experience in ways that allows them to actually learn from. So that's sort of connected to what Dr. Coleman was saying. The other pieces
and I echo you 100% there, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, because I've heard you speaking to that. Here's a couple of things I would say to that question, though, that Sean put into the chat. First of all, the quote unquote followers, the people we think are in the choir, like, we're a big part of the problem. Frankly, as I listen to Black and brown folks from other marginalized identities, like the folks who are outright, you know, wearing it on their sleeve, I hate other people, they're a small percentage of the problem. It's a part of the problem, but it's folks who think they're doing just fine from dominant culture who are dismissive in meetings. It's men who talk over women, despite the fact that they say, I'm a good guy. Yep, I'm a good guy, but they talk over women. And it's white guys who do that, white folks who do that to BIPOC folks. And it's people who assume that we're so much alike that I don't need to ask you about your opinion because you're just like me. So part of the, you know, if 40% of the people think they're on board, there's a good percentage of that from dominant culture who have a lot of work to do. And that's a learning for me. That's been a learning for me. I count myself as one of those people who long ago said, I'm with them. I'm with them. Yep, I'm with that group. I'm with that group. I'm with that group, until I came to really understand how I was showing up in the world. I wasn't showing up well in my family. I wasn't showing up well in my community with regards to diversity. So the first piece is we got work to do regardless of where we are. The second piece I would say is that those of us who come to it from a values mission kind of place assume that's the right way to come to this work. Well, what if it's just one of the ways to come to this work? And what if our trying to get them to come to it the way we come to it is part of the problem? What if instead we help lay out just the facts? So this is happening in Minnesota. And in this region of Minnesota, there's a group that's working to help smaller communities recognize the realities of their future. Their populations are declining, they're having fewer babies, and more of the young people are leaving the community. Their businesses don't have enough people to hire to do the work they want to do. Those are the facts. So what do you want to do about that? The business case for those communities is, if we don't become inclusive, we shrivel. So if you want to have a place to retire in your own home and get the services you want, you got to find a way to bring people into that community or get people to stay. And they're not all going to look like dominant culture folks. So the business case, just what are the facts? And how do they drive it is sort of a second thing I would say. And the third piece I would say is that as you start to build a culture in an organization that says, here's the expectation, inclusion is the expectation, then what happens is some folks who are just not ready to do that or choose not to embrace that, they will self-select themselves elsewhere. So there is huge power in peer pressure, and it can be a positive peer pressure to say, this is not an organization in which racist comments and emails and texts and sexist behavior are going to be tolerated. We have a higher expectation than that. And so if that's stuff that you're really attached to, this is going to be an uncomfortable place for you to be. And so when I work with corporate leaders, it's like, let's try to give everyone the education and all the support that we can offer them to do their individual work, to show up in the way that we expect, that the company expects, that the mission statement expects. And then the folks who can't do that or don't choose not to be able to do that, they self-select themselves away. But it starts by willing to have that clarity from leadership to say, here's the basis of how we are, here's who we are. And then having the tools, giving people the tools to be able to live that. And I would say the grace to recognize people are going to make mistakes. So it's not about one and you're done, but it's about, okay, that was a mistake. How are we going to repair and how are we going to learn? So thoughts.
Go for it, Heidi. Thank you so much. Great,
Yeah.
Great info.
So much goodness in there. This question is for Dr. Coleman. Albert said, can you talk to the legacy of late Congressman Perrin Mitchell and how important his work was for small businesses?
Oh, definitely, definitely. The late, great Congressman Perrin Mitchell from the great state of Maryland is often considered the forefather of minority business development, which also kicked off women business development in the United States. And he was a congressman who fought for many, many, many years to have federal agencies become inclusive of diverse firms in their procurement practices. And so he was successful in having legislation passed to have goals established within many operating agencies of the federal government to set up specific units within these federal agencies to serve diverse populations, from minorities, women, veterans, people with disabilities, to open up the procurement opportunities for those various underrepresented groups. So he is often considered the father of minority business development in the United States, and he was very, very instrumental in that regard. And I'd like to add one interesting note, that it was President Nixon and an executive order that President Nixon authored when he was in office to force open many agencies to consider and have their purchases open up to different ethnic and other underrepresented populations. So the work toward creating a more robust and diverse supplier diversity environment stems from both President Nixon with an executive order that he wrote, as well as the ongoing work of the late great Congressman Perrin Mitchell from the state of Maryland.
Thank you for that. We're going to be coming to our close pretty soon. I do want to ask another question if we don't have one from the audience here. This is coming behind, Kevin, you mentioned earlier kind of the challenge when people kind of think they've arrived, right, in this concept of fluency. But Dr. Coleman and Kevin, I'd love for you to talk about just in general on a corporate level, when corporations kind of feel like they're doing pretty good, they're doing X or Y and they've had some level of impact, but maybe they're not as aware of some of their blind spots. And what's the danger of that, and what can they do to shore that up?
So from when corporations think that they're doing great and they don't recognize that they have blind spots, and what can they do to address those blind spots? Well, it really starts at the top. It really starts with leadership. And I think in most cases, for companies to realize that they're not where they think they are, is that they have to have diverse boardrooms. And because once you have diverse boardrooms at the very highest level of the corporation directing the management team, then you have different viewpoints at the very highest level of the corporation saying, you need to become aware of and sensitive to blank, okay? But if you do not have those diverse voices in the boardroom, then you're never going to really pat yourself on the back and say, hey, we're doing a great job because we have a 20% spend with our diverse companies in our supply chain. That's not going to cut it, because what companies have realized is that it's not just about your spend with diverse companies. It's about your brand image. It's about your corporate social responsibilities. It's about a much broader range of activities that says that we understand and get that it's important that our brands and what we do in all the communities that we settle in, that there are benefits that accrue to those communities because they are our customers. And so we have to make sure that we're doing the kinds of things that will support those communities, because those communities help make us profitable as a corporation. And so it's not just, the internal work that can be done. It's not just, having a supplier diversity program. It's really about understanding that, that you have to really become a global citizen with high sensitivities to a very broad range of issues and needs, and be receptive to very different kinds of approaches to make sure that companies do not have blind spots.
Kevin, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think that that representation at the highest levels, which is what I hear you saying, Dr. Coleman, like in the boardroom and in the C-suite, and that's why representation matters. I would say a company that says, we're doing just fine, the question is, so, and what's your data, right? What's your disaggregated data? What tells you you're doing just fine? Again, this notion of fluency is it's ongoing. I mean, most companies that I suspect most companies today don't look at any other area of their operations and saying, well, our this or that, we're just fine. Like the competitiveness of today's sort of corporate world requires people to be ongoing, innovating, becoming more efficient, more effective, more productive. And this arena is no different. So anyone who says like, oh, yep, we got a phone system. We had a really good phone system a while back and it's just fine. It's like, well, what are the features and what do you need? I think that this isn't unlike that. We have to help people realize that, the world's changing. The world continues to change. The awarenesses that we have and need to have, that the language we use today there's language that we use around gender today that 10 years ago, I certainly wasn't hearing. It may have been places, but it wasn't in the places that I, as a cis male, was exposed to, even in doing the work that I do. And so like language changes, consciousness changes, we need to keep evolving with it if we're going to stay sort of on par, much less ahead of the curve. And so I think when there's blind spots, anyone from internal constituents to external constituents can be asking the question, like, what, sort of raising the issue, maybe not asking the question, but raising the issue of here's where we're falling short. And if people are sort of articulating, I think we're doing just fine. And I'm just thinking about a client where one of the lead folks contacted me and their HR person contacted me and said, yeah, but all of our directors, they think we're just fine. And the HR director is watching turnover just like flush through the organization. There's a disconnect. Leadership has a disconnect from really sort of the operations of that particular organization. So if you're in a position to speak to that, if you'll be listened to, which is sort of part of that allyship, right? So someone who looks like Keith talking internally about that may not be listened to. Oh, you're whining. Someone who looks like me may be heard differently if top management looks like me. So it's a little bit about recognizing our influence relative to allyship and saying, boy, I got to tell you, you need to be listening to Keith. I've been listening to Keith that I think you need to be listening to Keith. It doesn't not that I speak for Keith. It's that I go, I think you need to be listening to Keith. I think Keith has some important things. So it's about connecting the source to the folks who need to hear the source. And I would consider that an act of allyship.
Awesome stuff. Dr. Coleman, any other additional things on that lines?
No, I think, Kevin has made some really good points about that. And so, I think this has been a very, very helpful, hopefully it's been a very helpful webinar for attendees, and I appreciate their attention and their listening to us.
Okay. And Heidi, did you have something as we kind of close out here, or?
Nope. You can go ahead and do your thing. I just was turning on my video.
Okay, no worries. As we close, what are a lot of great information, a lot for people to process and take in, and certainly I know I'll be coming back to watch this and listen to this, and we'll try to disseminate this to others. And I encourage as many people as possible to do it. We know we don't always get the in-crowd, kind of audience, but we record these for posterity to share with a lot of folks. And I think this one has been the most powerful one we've had thus far, chock full of great information. What are some tangible things that people can take away or can think about in the next couple of weeks, or that they could do? Let's talk about it on that level, that they could do personally besides share this information, share this recording, anything that they can maybe take to their organizations, something simple and tangible.
Sure. So as I was thinking about preparing for this webinar and having an academic background, I did a little research to try to find some good, short, impactful, meaningful articles or websites that people can visit and really begin to build their fluency around supplier diversity and why companies embark on creating a supplier diversity program. And so some of those I think we've been able to put into the chat, but I compile about 5 or 6. And so Heidi mentioned that she was going to sort of keep those together and create a PDF and make them available to attendees. And so I would just encourage all of our audience members, all of our attendees to check out those resources. Again, coming from professorial background and expecting my students to read the abstract or read the assigned readings, you might say I have some assigned readings for you to really help you create a bigger, broader, better picture of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and supplier diversity. And I think it'll be worth your time if you took the time to read those.
Kevin, would you like to chime in, and any final thoughts from you for the day?
Thanks. Thank you for that. And Dr. Coleman, it's been a pleasure to share this conversation with you. I just really appreciate all of the insight and information expertise that you bring to this conversation. So I wanted to say that before my last couple, my to-dos, my takeaways, like something you can do later today, you can do it tomorrow, you can do it into the next week. One would be, notice the next time you have some sort of negative reaction to something someone says or does. And before you react to that, before you respond to that, hold for a moment possibility that the story you're telling yourself about that event may not completely describe what really actually transpired. There may be other ways that they might be, and you could view that event, ways that are just as legitimate as the story that you're telling yourself, that we tell ourselves. So it's about, the first action step is pause instead of when you react. Instead of reacting, pause and go, maybe there's more information I need to have, and get curious about what that looked like from their perspective. That's an intercultural skill. The second thing I would offer, more at the systemic level, is notice whose voices are present and what voices are missing. Question the notion that our own perspective is sufficient to understand how a range of people experience any decision, any policy, any practice. I think people often act out of goodwill, but lack of broad understanding. So dominant culture folks make policies all the time that affect a whole range of folks who aren't from predominant culture out of a place of goodwill, but frankly, ignorance to the range of ways that that policy, that decision, that practice might get experienced by someone else. So notice whose voices are present, and then work to bring in legitimate, meaningfully those other voices as you make decisions, policies, and practices. Those would be my couple quick takeaways.
Great advice, Kevin.
Thank you, gentlemen. This has been an extraordinary program, chock full of great information. I'm sure we'll have you back again, and we've left their contact information for folks to connect with them directly. Again, we'll have this recording available for everyone, and then you can feel free to visit the EDGE website to learn more about EDGE. And we want your suggestions on upcoming EDGE-inar. So let us know what you'd like to see. Let us know how you enjoyed this one. I think we'll be sending out a survey. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to work with you. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you on the next one. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.